This is a Retina MacBook, and its tale is a tragic one. A rushed job meant to sell the world on a radical new kind of laptop. It started as a pretty good idea, but it was executed so poorly that it now languishes as a short-lived and forgotten experiment that lasted just 3 short years. In today's video, we're going to talk about what made the MacBook so interesting, why it failed, and why I think Apple should bring it back. So get subscribed because this one is going to be interesting. This is one of the last 12-inch MacBooks ever made. It's a 2017 model that was manufactured in 2018. Now, technically, Apple continued to sell this all the way through the fall of 2019, but it had been unchanged for more than 2 years at that point. There were only ever 3 revisions of the Retina MacBook. The first one, which came out in March of 2015, then an update in 2016, and this final revision in 2017 before it slowly faded into obscurity, being discontinued in September of 2019. When you put it like that, it seems like the 12-inch MacBook was a short-lived failure, but in many ways, it wasn't. Most importantly, when Tim Cook walked out on stage and revealed the 2015 12-inch MacBook, the primary function for the 12-inch Retina MacBook was to reinvent what the MacBook could be, as well as set the design trend for the future of Apple laptops. That's a lot of weight on this tiny device's shoulders. But despite that, after some conversations with people familiar with the way the MacBook was developed, this thing, apparently, was a rush job. That's right, folks. The computer to which every modern MacBook can trace its design heritage was rushed. And that's because most of the time that was spent on the rather short development of this was on its design. The actual, computer part that is inside it and makes it run was a bit of an afterthought. And that really shows when you look at the reliability record of the original 2015 Retina MacBook. They are absolutely abysmal. Nearly every single component has failures. There's the screen delamination. Almost every Retina MacBook has that. There's the butterfly keyboard failure. That one, the 2015, has it by far the worst. The keyboard is practically unusable on many of them. But perhaps more seriously, it also had issues where the one single USB Type-C port would fail. It also had issues where the SSDs would fail all the time. Even the CPUs have catastrophic failure. So many 2015s, many of them have since been bricked. But while it was a rush job and didn't end up turning out all that great, certainly its first generation, the 12-inch MacBook brought a lot to the table. For one, there's the design generation. There's no point denying that this thing, even this particular one, which is really beaten up, looks good. It's a 6-year-old design, and it still looks modern and fresh, apart from the bezels. But it wasn't just design. This was the first MacBook with USB Type-C, which obviously has been a direction Apple wants to continue traveling in. It also introduced the Force Touch trackpad, which at the time seemed like a workaround to get a trackpad into such a thin device, but has since become revered as one of the best trackpads that money can buy. It has phenomenal speakers, and it introduced the trend of Apple really focusing on audio in their products, and it even set the groundwork for Apple Silicon. That's right, folks, this is something that you might not know, but according to conversations that I've had with numerous insiders, there were prototypes of this 12-inch MacBook well before it came out. We're talking 2014, where they were running these things with modified iPhone Apple Silicon chips. So when the Apple Silicon transition was announced and people said, bring back the 12-inch MacBook with Apple Silicon, Apple thought of that already in 2014. This may or may not surprise you, honestly. The 12-inch MacBook has always kind of been, an iPad that is shaped like a MacBook and runs Mac OS. It's got a small screen, it's incredibly thin and light, it's fanless, it's an iPad, but it just doesn't quite work as well because unlike an iPad, it's running Intel, and it feels like a compromise as a result of that. Even this 2017 model, which has a improved Core M chip, is not powerful. I ran Cinebench on it. It scored 1,625. Someone paid $1,300 for this. So in retrospect, it seems like Apple really should have put Apple Silicon inside of this thing. And honestly, Apple is probably thinking that in retrospect as well, because they tried to. So according to the people that I spoke with, the 12-inch MacBook was prototyped with variations on the A8 or A8X chip. Now, I would imagine that this thing was developed with Intel in mind the entire time. I don't think this was a product that was developed with Apple Silicon and then changed at the last moment, although it's possible. This is definitely evidence, though, that Apple was let down by Intel. This is clear proof from 6 years ago that Apple wanted to make laptops that looked like this, that were this thin, with no fans, with all-day battery life, and they just couldn't do it in 2015, or 2016, or 2017. But now, Apple has another shot, and I think they would be foolish if they don't take it. Imagine this exact laptop, but with Apple Silicon. It would probably have better battery life. This thing, even when it was new with its incredibly advanced terraced battery cells, which everyone at Apple was very keen to talk about, still could only really pull 5 or 6 hours of battery. Not to mention it was really hot and it overheated and thermal throttled and all that stuff. None of that would be an issue anymore if Apple just literally took out the Intel board, threw that away. It's garbage. Put in Apple Silicon, literally just put an iPhone board in this thing and install macOS onto it. It would be fantastic. There are a number of people that are die-hard 12-inch MacBook fans. And honestly, I sympathize. I think this is a great form factor, but every time I try to get into one of these, I'm disappointed. Even this 2017 one, which is the fixed version. I mean, for the price, these things in good condition are still a couple $100, and for that, you're barely getting Core 2 Duo performance. Okay, maybe a little bit more than Core 2 Duo, but not worth $400. Honestly, you'd be better off buying a base model $300 iPad and buying a Logitech keyboard than you would buying one of these. A couple of Chrome tabs will melt your lap if you're using this thing on the go. But it's a shame because so many people saw so much promise in this. If Apple had been able to use Apple Silicon and fix the keyboard and shrink the bezels a little bit or just make the screen a little bit larger, but otherwise kept it exactly the same as it is here, a 4-year-old device, it would be fantastic. To quote Tim Cook, "Can you even see it? There it goes."
Can you even see it? I can't even feel it. There it goes.
So what about now? When this thing came out, Apple Silicon was a pipe dream. It was something that Apple tried to do but just couldn't make work. But now we're in the throes of a 2-year transition where a laptop like this is possible now. And I want it quite badly. But there's a problem. When people like myself talk about reinventing this MacBook for the modern age, there's 3 main things that we would want changed. Number 1, better keyboard. Number 2, Apple Silicon. And number 3, the bezels. Number 3 is a little bit more minor, but it's not to be overlooked. These are pretty thick bezels, and Apple is trending away from that, but the problem is, if you shrink the bezels on this 12-inch form factor, you'd also have to shrink the keyboard. Apple was very clear that the width of this MacBook was determined by having a full-sized keyboard.
That actually defines the size of the notebook, that keyboard.
It's kind of ironic that they wanted to save the keyboard, but they also ruined it by making it the butterfly keyboard. But either way, I get the argument, This is a standard width keyboard, and while the shallowness, the butterflyness is very uncomfortable, the size of the keys is spot on. And so if you were to shrink the bezels, you'd also shrink the form factor, and then you'd shrink the keyboard, and that really wouldn't be good. So realistically, in order to get around that problem, to get smaller bezels, you'd have to just make the display larger. And once you do that, you're getting pretty close to a 13-inch MacBook, like the MacBook Air. So why would you need to have both of those existing in the lineup, especially if this would be more expensive? Then you'd end up with the same problem that Apple had when it came out, is that it sat right between the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, but it was less powerful than either of them, more expensive than both of them, and just kind of weird in the lineup. But here's the thing. Maybe you don't have to reinvent this 12-inch MacBook to recapture the magic of what this represented. The rumor that we've been hearing about for a little while now about a redesigned, colorful MacBook is starting to ring a bell, because as we've seen there, it is very thin, very light, fanless, has a small display with thinner bezels, which results in a shrunken form factor. It seems like it's most of the way to becoming a reincarnation of this 12-inch Retina MacBook. And at the end of the day, if you were to make this 11.6 inches wide instead of 11.2 inches wide, how different is that, really? So I propose to you that the upcoming redesign, this colorful mass-market MacBook that will probably sit somewhere between the $999 MacBook Air and the $1,799 14-inch MacBook Pro, could in fact be a spiritual successor to this. I mean, think back to the renders that Jon Prosser came out with. Look at the side profile. See how the device is barely thicker than a USB-C port? Well, that's basically how it is on the 12-inch MacBook. The USB-C port defines the side profile. Now, obviously, if you're going to talk about updating this design, then you'd have to talk about the new design trend that Apple is taking, and that is basically iPad Pro design language. So no more taper, no more slightly rounded top and bottom, flat side, flat bottom. And at that point, once you apply those changes to this, it starts to look a lot like that. Curious, isn't it? That's another reason why I think this upcoming colorful MacBook with all of the colors from the iMac is not a MacBook Air. It's been widely reported on as the next MacBook Air. Even Mark Gurman said a new MacBook Air. Now, I'm not one to be out here disagreeing with Mark Gurman, except for where he said that the new MacBook Pros will come with 64 gigabytes of RAM. I'm still skeptical on that one. When Jon Prosser released those renders, he was very clear in saying that there was no actual product name associated with it, and that it was assumed to be an upcoming MacBook Air. I don't think it is. The MacBook Air always tends to lag behind. It's Apple's cheapest laptop, so it's not going to get the newest, flashiest design right away. If you remember back to this current design generation, this came out in 2015. The MacBook Air didn't get this design until 2018, well after every other MacBook had been updated. So to think that the MacBook Air, which just got M1 in November, would just immediately get replaced with a new design, I'm skeptical. If Apple can wring another $300 out of you, you bet they're gonna try. And all they have to do is take the Air name off of that, release a 13-inch MacBook with a smaller footprint, all the colors, thinner design, fanless architecture at $1,300, take the M1 MacBook Pro, throw it in the trash, and there you have it, folks. The 12-inch MacBook, spiritually, has returned. Now, will any of this happen? Who knows? But I, for one, think it's pretty likely. If you agree with me, let me know what you would like to see in the comments below. If you disagree, let me know why, also in the comments below. And of course, regardless of your opinion, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.